With Ashes of Creation's augment system, Intrepid Studios is taking a directly opposite approach to class balance from basically every MMO you've ever played. To illustrate this, I've made a few animations since we can't exactly hop into game and get the footage we need. So we're going to start with a fighter archetype, and the fighter gets an ability early on called Rush. Rush is a gap closer, similar to the gap closer of pretty much any melee class in any tab target game. You take a few big steps towards your target, leap into the air, and land at his feet. But what happens to Rush at level 25 when you pick a secondary archetype and get your official class? For our purposes, we're going to say we picked a mage secondary and became a spell sword. What happens now is for every ability you got from level 1 to 25, you get to pick from 4 schools of magics or disciplines associated with the secondary archetype choice, and change those abilities based on the flavor of those choices. The mage schools are teleportation, fire, frost, and lightning. We already know from Steven that a spell sword who chooses the teleportation augment to his rush ability turns that ability into a blink. Now, instead of the 1.5 seconds it takes to run and jump at our target and land at his feet, the whole thing happens instantaneously. It's a huge advantage and a far departure from what Rush originally was. What we don't know is what happens when you take the other augment choices. Fortunately, I've cooked up some ideas just to show how different they could be, starting with the fire augment. Now, instead of jumping, you run at a blazing speed towards your target, setting the ground aflame in the process and setting anyone between you and your target on fire. This again is a massive departure from the other two options and leads to very different strategies for using this ability. Choosing the frost augment changes the ability from a targeted attack to a templated one. Now, instead of going directly to whatever you have tab targeted or soft lock, pressing this ability gives you a circle that you have to manually place on the ground, and once placed, you leap into the air and land right in the middle of that circle. Everyone inside of the circle takes massive damage from an ice explosion, and then shards are sent in all directions, and anyone who gets hit by them gets rooted, or gets stacks of chilled, or becomes frozen. And then last, the lightning augment actually gives you charges, so that you actually have more than one use of the ability. It's fast, but not as fast as Blink, and allows you to close the gap again after your target uses an escape maneuver. These augments are massively different from one another. All of them have specific use cases, and I'm sure that if these were what we had when the game finally gets here, all of them would get used. I spent less than 10 minutes of thinking to come up with these 4. And I'm not a video game developer, and I'm not being paid to do this. These 4 variants that I've shown you would be just for the mage secondary. There are 7 other secondary class choices, assumedly each with 4 schools of magic or discipline to apply to Rush, meaning there are at least 32 variations of Rush and every other ability in the game. But even if some of those secondary choices only have 3 schools, or even 2, you're still talking about 20 or more variations for every skill in the game. For a long time, a lot of people have assumed that these augments couldn't possibly change the abilities up very much. How could you have that many variations per skill? Well, I've just shown you how easy it was to come up with 4 different augments that each make the skill unique. And again, I literally thought about this for less than 10 minutes. They've said some augments will make ranged skills into melee, targeted into templated, single target to AoE, and on and on and on. The build diversity with just this augment system alone would dwarf over any MMO on the market today. But then you add in the fact that any class can wear any armor and use any weapon. There are augments not associated with your secondary class, augments that only some people will have access to, and others will not. Nodes, locking and unlocking dungeons and world bosses, meaning some specific loot will be available on some servers, but not on others. Again, limiting who has access to different gear, and the diversity of this game goes into the stratosphere. And that's not even mentioning when the secondary archetype choice is going to change the way the class plays entirely. Take Cleric, for example. Typically, as a Cleric, you're a healer. You stand in the back, throw some heals, and try to keep everyone alive. But what if you take a Summoner secondary? Now you've become a Necromancer. A Necromancer is definitely not a healer. Well, I guess technically he is a healer, he's just always late. But never mind that. Your job changes from a healer to more of a support DPS role, conjuring zombies and ghouls and sending them in to fight and do damage. Editing Zillin here. I just realized while editing this video that Cleric Summoner is Shaman. It's Summoner Cleric that is a Necromancer, effectively negating the entire point I just made, but I already made the animation, so you're gonna watch them. So what the hell does all this have to do with class balance? Everything. For 20 years now, going back to at least World of Warcraft, developers have been trying to achieve 1v1 balance, or macro balance. And in order to do this, they've continuously tightened the differences between classes and gave us less and less and less ability to create variations of our class to make our DPS warrior be different from someone else's DPS warrior. In most modern MMOs, whatever class or spec you play, it's effectively identical to everyone else on Earth who's playing that same class or spec. I will admit, World of Warcraft recently has taken a step back in the direction of having a small number of variations on builds. But they do this so that if any one particular class or spec has an advantage over any other, they can tune a few numbers to try and make those two classes even. Here's the problem. They've never accomplished this in 20 years. Not ever. Not once. Not even for one patch cycle has WoW or any of its many clones had macro class balance. There have always been a class or classes that just stood above all or most of the others in virtually all aspects of the game. Macro balance is not possible. It never has been, and it never will be. Ashes of Creation is taking the exact opposite approach to this. They are going for micro balance. Intrepid wants you to be able to make a build that works really well for a specific encounter or against another specific build, but not all encounters or all builds. If you want to build a character that is awesome against a specific boss or a specific playstyle, but at the cost of being good in other areas, great. You can do that. If you want to make a build that simply has all movement increasing abilities to get you from resource node to resource node faster than others, you can do that. But don't expect to be able to really defend yourself if someone actually catches you. It's a market-oriented solution where people will be making builds to counter what some other guy in their region is doing right now, and then people will need to make builds to counter the counter, and then counter the counter of the counter, and so on and so on and so on into perpetuity. If WoW and its clones had a class balance mantra, it would be something like, through illusion of choice, allow every class and spec to have a 50-50 chance of winning against all other classes and specs, assuming equal skill. Where the Ashes of Creation mantra is more like, through actual real choice, allow every player to choose from a wide variety of skill variations to counter specific things, but not everything. To be meta in one aspect of the game, but not all. Intrepid realizes that balance is an illusion. They've accepted that there is no spoon. And in doing so, they've paradoxically brought much needed balance to the MMO genre.